we're going to show a documentary trailer, This Land is Our Land. Today, we are pleased to debut This Land is Our Land, a new short film series from The Emancipator about untold histories and consequences of dispossessed and stolen land. It was developed in partnership with filmmaker Funmi Onguru, who is currently developing a feature-length doc on freedom towns. Are we 100% ready? Because if we're not, I can still, we're good? Okay. Okay, let's take a look.
We are in Clarksville at the Haskell House. Clarksville is one of at least 15 freedom communities in Austin. And freedom communities basically are settlements, they are townships, also known as freedmen's towns and colonies that were established after the Civil War until about the 1930s by freed people. So the Haskell House is really one of the last symbols of what Clarksville was at one point, right? It's this freedom colony. Now we're gonna meet a family with long ties to Clarksville.
We are the Griffins from Clarksville. This is my sisters. And,
I'm Florence.
And I'm Verna Carroll.
And I'm Deborah.
I'm Rita.
My grandfather, Link Thompson, was raised in the Haskell House.
Linnell, his granddaddy. That's our mother's father.
Oh, wow.
Brother
Really?
Squire Johnson.
He looks like
And this is Mary Tutta Francis' father.
What does, like, looking at the Haskell House, I know it brings back certain memories and thoughts for me. What's the significance of this?
It's our bloodline. It's definitely positively our bloodline. A lot of history. With this house is how we learn what the first home looks like in Clarksville. That they all had cabin homes like this, and that's how they lived out here then. So it's really important to know.
Clarksville, as we see today, is different in many ways, even though there's work to preserve a lot of the landmarks. One of the main reasons that that's the case is because of the City of Austin Master Plan of 1928, which basically worked to segregate Austin. There was this effort to basically push these communities to what we now know, is historic East Austin. And the way they did that is by intimidation and threats and violence, and by denying resources and services like, water and flood measures and things like that. Clarksville, unlike, unfortunately, many other freedom communities in Austin, Clarksville really sustained itself, even in the midst of so many forces trying to tear the community apart. And so that really just is something really amazing, inspiring about the community, and something that I think we can all learn from.
All right, we are going to have our final panel, which is really connected to that trailer that we just saw, that very, very important trailer. Determining a Liberated Future. We'll start with Stephanie Lang, who we saw in that trailer. Stephanie Lang is a writer and community curator. Who uses the power of storytelling. No, thank you. Who uses the power of storytelling, as we see in Funmi Onguru's film, to explore concepts of home, resistance, and spirituality. Currently, Stephanie is working on a book of short stories centered around Black women's community organizing in the early 1900s. After the success of her curatorial debut of the photography exhibition Seen and Unseen, a Sunday afternoon in Clarksville, Stephanie founded Reclaim, an organization that reimagines the archives and uses them to discover and recover hidden, stolen, and lost narratives of Black people throughout the diaspora, and presents these findings through an artistic and thought-provoking lens. Next, Dr. Richard Reddick. Right there, in order. Dr. Richard Reddick is the incoming Senior Vice Provost. No, this is his second year. 1 year. Senior Vice Provost for Curriculum and Enrollment and Dean of Undergraduate Studies at UT Austin. Prior, he was the inaugural Associate Dean for Equity and Professor in the College of Education. Dr. Reddick is also a Longhorn, a proud Longhorn. And like my friend Rudy Mateer, is somebody who bleeds burnt orange through and through. Next we have, thank you, Virginia Cumberbatch. Virginia Cumberbatch. She's a proud LBJ graduate as well. As a storyteller, racial justice educator, and organizer, Virginia's work sits at the intersection of community advocacy and creative activism. With a heart to elevate the voices of people of color whose stories are often siloed or ignored, she co-birthed Rosa Rebellion, a production company for creative activism by and for women of color, creating space for the brilliance and thought leadership of women of color in media, policy, and community organizing. Beyond Rosa Rebellion, Virginia supports the development of a culture and ethos of equity for organizations as a racial justice educator and writer, working with brands like Bumble, Lululemon, the World Economic Forum, and more. Wow, that's great stuff. Okay, this is our final order. All right, this is our final panel for what's been really a very exciting Freedom Summit with so much artistry and creativity and great conversations. My first question really to all of you, and you're all creators in so many different ways and activists and policy experts, and this continues the last conversation. What can we do at this moment where, in so many ways, democracy and our ability to tell stories is really teetering on the brink? And that's not really being hyperbolic when we think about the passing of the anti-DEI legislation, and we think about really the suffocation of democratic discourse in our society right now in ways that we would have found unbelievable just a few years ago. And think of 2008, the election of Barack Obama. Think of 2012 and Michelle Obama, and 16 great speeches at the Democratic National Convention, things that we had never seen before in our lives. We would have never thought we'd be at this moment. What can we do? What are some, and I know what's cool about this panel is that everybody here is doing strategies for the question I'm asking. So I want you to really tell us what you're doing specifically in this arena to the best of your ability, especially now, and especially with storytelling that becomes something bigger than just the story.
Well, I think, the other panels have done sort of the incremental job of laying the groundwork around this. And so I love that we're ending this conversation around imagining a liberated future. I think we get caught up in just the work of dismantling and disrupting. It's like, well, when do we get to take space to like dream and imagine what liberation actually looks like and feels like? And, I often start here. There's only two areas that we can live in, right? We're either part of dismantling systems of oppression or a part of maintaining them. There's no neutrality. And a lot of us are only comfortable in that neutrality, right? Where we're not necessarily disrupting or dismantling, right? That's even the conversation we're having around changing the language, right, of these conversations around justice and equity. We're not comfortable with the truth, and the truth is, right, that we come from a land that was founded not only on the backs of Black people, but on stolen land from Indigenous people. That is our birth, right? And so we have to face that head on. James Baldwin talks about, right, the only way to truth is to face it. And so I think we start there. I think that's the genius of the work of Fumi and Stephanie and so many of us that are writers, Dr. Joseph as well, and storytellers, is that we oftentimes want to start this conversation in June of 2023. Like, okay, cool. Well, this is what we need to do about the election, and this is what we need to do about this policy, right? Policies are birthed from lived experience, which are our stories. And if we're not telling those stories accurately, then what are we facing? What are we trying to address from a systemic level? And so, we just watched this documentary about Clarksville, and I talk about, we have to have an understanding of how our history is a part of our current reality, right? That those travesties are still informing our experience, right? We talk about it in past tense, like, oh yeah, that time where Black people were freed, and then we just politely ask them to move to the east of East Avenue, or what we call I-35 now. We are still grappling with that decision, right? The ways in which east of 35, right, we have schools that have lost its accreditation, but west of 35, we have high-performing schools, right? East of 35, up until a few years ago when we had Dell Children's, we had a healthcare desert, right? Up until we had Whole Foods on 5th Street, we had a food desert, right? And so it's more, we oftentimes want to talk about policy, but policies don't mean much if we haven't shifted cultural paradigms or practices, right? The Civil Rights Act changed policy, but it didn't change how people were treated in schools. It didn't change who got loans. It didn't change who got access to education. And so I think part of this, is around our storytelling, because that's what informs or shifts our cultural paradigm, our cultural memory as a people. Because if we're not starting from the same truth, then I don't think we can move ahead. Dr. Joseph mentioned one of my favorite authors, Audre Lorde, and she talks about, right, I am not free while any other woman is unfree or any other person of color remains chained. And our liberation is tied up in one another, right? We don't get the Immigration Act of 1965 without the movement of Black people, right? We don't get the Disabilities Act without the movement of Black and brown people. And so part of this is having an understanding of how not our history as instructive about what it looks like to truly repair, right? Not just disrupt, but then start to do the work of repair.
Awesome. Thank you. That's awesome.
Wow. Co-sign everything Virginia said. It just struck me that this is a panel of Austinites, and
unicorns in the house.
I'm the kind of asterisk Austinite because I moved here as a 9th grader. Actually, Stephanie and I went to high school together. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is the fact that I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. I wanted to join the Air Force. That was my goal. But moving to Austin at the age of 14 turned me into an educational researcher and a scholar of inequity. Because you can't move here and learn about, my dad was in the Air Force, so I lived overseas. I come here and I had all the things about America that you learn, and it wasn't happening. Like, it straight up was not happening in Go Valley or off of Berkman Drive. It wasn't happening in those communities. I'm like, what's going on? And so I think that was a very vivid example for me. And so when I think about that question, during the pandemic, I read a book called On Tyranny by Tim Snyder. If you've not read that book, I recommend you read it because it tells you how democracies fall apart, right? And it's not usually in a explosion. It's just these gradual things that happen, the normalization of othering of people and so forth that happens. And so I think what we've done today is really important, is just active engagement in democratic processes. Dr. Joseph, the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy has been so active in encouraging democratic engagement, bringing people together, having dialogues, encouraging people to activate their voices. And something that Amber said earlier in the earlier panel I thought was really important is just this importance of centering on accuracy and truth, right? I just literally got off a plane yesterday from the UK with 21 students from the University of Texas who were incredible. And I was talking about the issue of the monoculture, some of us in this panel, I'm going to probably put Virginia, she's a little younger than us, but we can remember events that we all were participating in. Michael Jackson's Thriller dropping, you name it. All those things, we remember what happened. We were all there. There is no monoculture now. There's so many different ways to go. So the same is true for information and knowledge and news. So many different sources. How do you check sources? How do you know what's going on? So I think we have to really sort of commit to that. And everything we've been talking about today is based in reality. Nobody's been talking about their opinions on things or how they think about things. Folks have been discussing facts. Verifiable, objective data. It's out there, right? I also think the issue of organizing is important. And again, CSRD has been doing a great job of this. All of us in this room, the call has been made multiple times about the importance of us being in co-conspiratorial modes together, working together. And something Virginia mentioned, Audre Lorde and the ADA, so many of these things I think are important to realize. These are the works of Black folks and Black folks who had intersectional identities. So we occupy so many parts of identity, and we've worked in coalitions so effectively, and the coalition has to be broader. If anything, the last 3 years have shown us that coalition building is critical. We have to attend to it. We have to commit to it. We have to work through the hard stuff of working together, because sometimes working together is difficult and challenging. We have competing agendas. But the most important thing is that we commit to the work, we stay in the work, and we engage in the work, and we sustain it. When you say, what can we do? I wrote a book about DEI. Interestingly timed. It's coming out next month. But in the book, it's called Restorative Resistance in Higher Education, leading in an era of racial awakening and reckoning. I really talk optimistically about doing the work in DEI. I've been doing this work for 30 years, and we called it multiculturalism, right? And I know that I have felt very encouraged by the fact that as we've gone in this work, more and more people are seeing the value from different perspectives. It's not simply social justice. It's not simply, the way things should be. It's economic. And I'm good with all of those rationales. And so it really is stirring to understand that we've made incremental progress, but like most work that we do that's progress and moving towards equity and inclusion, there's always a massive resistance. It comes in so many different ways. And this way, it's kind of what we've seen before. So I think what we've talked about today has been very instructive as far as understanding we've seen this movie before. But the question is, do we have the resources, do we have the capacity, and do we have the willingness to sort of commit collectively to this work? It's very easy to say, well, if y'all get ahead, I'm going to get behind, so I'm not going to really be with you on this, versus saying, we're all catching this. And there's enough for all of us to be successful and move forward. So I really think it's our engagement in these spaces. And I love what Rudy said about the fact that, we need more people in these spaces, especially people who probably wouldn't be compelled to come to this event, but they need to be here because this is our democracy at work. And I just thought it was really interesting to think about the idea that there could be sort of a reaction to the increasing demographic realities in this country, in the state. And the reality is, the best way to sort of be ready for that is to be in the conversation versus sort of holding on and trying to maintain systems of oppression without realizing no matter what you do, over time, it's going to crumble. And it's better to be in that conversation about making things equitable and just and working together than to be on the receiving end or on the other side of things when it all falls apart. I'm just saying.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's real. And I feel like, Virginia, were you looking at my notes? Because I'm like, yes. I guess to add, I often quote my grandmother, Granny. And one thing she always said to me was, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so thinking about this question, I really view it through this lens of the work that I've done and am doing on, brown and Black communities, and specifically starting with freedom communities. And thinking about how much we don't know, right? And I don't know if Miss Houston is still here, or Houston. Okay. I just want to give you your flowers. I mean, a lot of us didn't even know about the 1928 plan until when she was in office and said there needs to be a reckoning for this. So I just wanted to honor you. So in thinking about the freedom colonies, the first thing that I thought about was our relationship to enslavement, or the way this, the city, Austin, often does not talk about it, right? It's like coded language around homesteads and these different things. But thinking about, what the dream, what the thought were for people purchasing this land. And, first of all, purchasing land that was considered untenable and undesirable. They weren't getting this premium land, right? They were getting land that was very difficult to do anything with. But like was quoted earlier, they made a way out of no way. So thinking about that, thinking about when schools were finally, the city of Austin finally provided a school, thinking about this school being, underfunded and overcrowded, thinking about the impact of the 1928 and 1929 plan and the, denial of services and resources, things like flood measures, thinking about all those things, and this is kind of forced displacement. And one of the reasons is around, these homes and these freedom colonies are falling apart, or this and that is happening because they couldn't get bank loans, because, they were limited to certain kind of labor or jobs, right? So thinking about that, and thinking about where we are right now, some of that might sound familiar, because these are still things that we're dealing with, right? When I talk to, various folks in the different communities that I'm part of, the same things come up, and issues around food insecurities and food swamps, like in Colony Park, not having grocery stores, and been fighting for that, forever, environmental racism. Certain homes, certain communities, are having homes built with dangerous and hazardous, lead and different things like that. Like thinking about all of those things, thinking about transportation, right? That was an issue. School closures, right? That's something that happened from the freedom communities. That's stuff that's happening now. So all these things are continuing to happen. And so, part of why I even did this is to try to understand what's happening right now. And this speaks to that. And so I would say always being led by the community that are most impacted and most vulnerable. Oftentimes what can happen, especially in these ivory towers, is we're telling folks what they need to do instead of letting them tell us what needs to be done, and then we get to work to kind of support them. So I think working with all of these different people that are already on the ground doing this work, and understanding that we need to bring all kind of folks into this. Like artists have always been the keepers of the truth. They need to be very much involved, and they can get the word out, and they can speak to these things in a way that can access and connect with people, in a very powerful way. So, yeah, that's what I'd say.
For my next question really dovetails into everything we've been talking about, but very clearly, I've been reading a lot about affirmative action. I've always studied affirmative action, but the histories of affirmative action for a new project I'm doing. And one of the things I can see with the evolution of affirmative action, especially post-Bakke, is that the original intent, and I want us to talk about this, there were really deep-seated moral and political commitments as affirmative action was initially articulated by activists from the grassroots like Stephanie has just talked about, right? And sometimes we had mobilizers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talk about it, Ella Baker, organizers talk about it. But the deep moral political commitments were about efforts at repair. And they were really, you know, what's so interesting about the diversity, equity, inclusion, that evolves because of Justice Blackmun and the way in which he says, look, we need to, the only way I can justify this, and him and Thurgood Marshall had a big conversation about this, because he asked Thurgood Marshall, how long do you think, if we keep affirmative action as it is, would it need to be going on? And Thurgood Marshall basically was like, forever, you know, like there's not a, because the harm has been so big, it's not a, and that really gave Justice Blackmun pause, and he, for his legal thinking and legal reasoning, he came to think of race as something that could be a factor, but shouldn't be the factor. And he says that diversity is a good thing. And his example in his legal reasoning is a working class white student from Nebraska or Omaha or Oklahoma would add diversity to the classroom, right? In that way, and a black student could too. So now that we're really heading towards the end of affirmative action, as we know it, in terms of with this court, probably, that's what people, the expectation. And it's been watered down over a number of different years. You know, we had the Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had said when she sort of had a decision and reasoning that allowed it to remain, that she said, look, I don't expect this to be around in 25 years. I mean, she said it. She's saying like, this is, you know, there's gonna be a point that this racism thing is fixed, okay? And so we don't need, you know, stop your belly aching, which is the thing, right? So I want us to, what are the deep moral and political commitments that we need renewed in our own time, that Juneteenth has actually provided us a context to talk about? Because I think one of those commitments is finally a discussion about slavery. It's just about slavery. Harvard University has just published this brilliant report about their complicity in racial slavery. They're not the first. Georgetown has done it. Ruth Simmons is the GOAT. And Brown University, Ruth Simmons said yes when another president might have said no. Okay, so she's the GOAT when it comes to all this. And when we think about the Harvard report, it implicates Harvard in multiple ways. Harvard presumed to own human beings, but Harvard also took money from people who were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, right? And Harvard is being very transparent about this. Now, they're saying, well, there's a $100 million fund. We're going to do more with HBCUs. It might not be the repair that you think is right, but they're being transparent. And Tamika Brown-Nagin and different historians were part of this process at Harvard, right? So that's really important. But the moral and political commitments, even from the 1960s, we've sort of turned our backs on it, even with the DEI talk. So one of the things as a historian that I'm seeing is that when we first talked about affirmative action, we talked about it, we combined policy, history, morality all together. Certainly Dr. King did this, but John F. Kennedy says the same thing, June 11th, 1963. He says the issue of systemic racism, it's as old as scripture and as clear as the Constitution. We need to have different new policies. So what are the moral and political commitments that we need? And I want you to specifically think about Juneteenth and this idea of black dignity and citizenship, because in many ways, DEI, which I support, was still running away from those moral and political commitments of what does black equality look like in a country based on racial slavery? Does it look like, Stephanie, you've got a great crib at Martha's Vineyard and you host the Obamas? Is that the equality? Or does it look like something much different when it comes to mass incarceration and people who are in food deserts and people who are disabled and their kids have asthma, right? People who try to apply to this school and can't get to this school. What does equality look like? We asked those profound questions 60 years ago and even earlier, but I would argue from reading more about affirmative action that we stopped asking those questions once Justice Blackmun said, here are the narrow parameters that we can think about equity within?
Where to start?
Unpack that.
Exactly. Easy question, 45 seconds or less. What trips me up is just like how profoundly short our memory is, right? Okay, so I came to the LBJ school in 2014 and had the opportunity to help tell the stories of the precursors. Interviewed Colonel Holland and his wife Peggy Holland, tell the story of integration at UT. That was a year after Trayvon Martin was killed. It was during the time the uprising in Missouri and with Mike Brown. So simultaneous to me sitting at the feet of my elders to help tell a story of theirs that had not been told comprehensively.
Can you tell us the title so people can get
sorry,
the
it's
book?
called As We Saw It, The Story of Integration at the University of Texas. And it was published in 2018, which meant it took 60 years for the university to comprehensively document this story, right? To pay homage, right, to these students who willingly or unwillingly were a part of disrupting this, the experience of being ostracized from this institution, the first public institution of the state of Texas to be integrated. So while I'm sitting at the feet of my elders, hearing these stories that, as someone who's born and raised in Austin, the daughter of a UT law grad, had never heard these stories. And I'm sort of confounded with the idea of navigating this space that was not built for me, right? And engaged in conversation in classrooms with my policy professors who were telling me that race is a segmented ideology connected to policy, which is confusing, right? And what I acknowledged during that time, right, was I could literally take the photos from the archives, right, that literally have photos in that book that says Austin is not progressive. It was a photo from 1952, and transplant that to a protest happening in 2015 or 2016. And so if I'm not even 2 full generations removed from the people who had to disrupt this space, these systems, right, to be acknowledged as full human beings and have the rights and liberties to pursue an education here. If I can sit in their company and we're still having the same conversation, I'm confused on how affirmative action has lived its lifespan. Right? And so part of the issue I think we are confronted with is, one, our lack of sustainability as a people, right? We are less than 3 years removed from the so-called racial reckoning of 2020. And yet I'm having conversations with companies and schools, institutions, and they're like, I thought we already did that work. I wrote that one check in 2020, right? I did that one march. We had that one workshop. Right, there was a study done last year of something like $500 million had been promised from all these massive companies to support racial justice across the country. Only 4% 2 years later had actually been dispersed, distributed. Right, so our lack of understanding, first of all, of just time, apparently, right? But also our lack of sustained effort, right? That this work of equity, this work of racial justice, we're talking about undoing 400 plus years of harm, 400 plus years of creating systems that were predicated on the understanding of who would be valued as human and who would not. So it's gonna take a little bit longer than 3 years, it's gonna take a little bit longer than 60 years, and it's gonna take a little bit more than just shifting policy. Like, this has to be, you know, we've been throwing around sort of a language shift from being like allies to co-conspirators. Rosa used the word co-agitator, because like I literally want people to be like an irritant in the spaces they're in, like to be agitators in the systems they're in. And that will require ceding power, that will require ceding privilege, that will require ceding position. And so many of us want to be in our spaces of comfort and convenience, right? If it's not a convenient narrative, then we don't want to tell it. If it would require us to be uncomfortable, that we might have to adjust our practices or our policies, hire differently, right? Or cede our position on boards, then all of a sudden we don't want to do it. And so I think this imagining of a new future requires One, for us to have sustained investment in this work, to co-labor. Stephanie talked about, to work alongside the community. When I used to work at UT, and in our work here, I would talk about how UT is an ivory tower, and the only way to shift from being an ivory tower to a community anchor is to no longer believe that the people with the 3 letters behind their names are the experts. We're experts because we have lived experience. We're experts because we've been doing this work for decades, and we've been watching our parents and our grandparents do this work with little to no resources. And so it requires that co-laboring, that collaboration in order for us to move to that space. And I think the last thing I would say about what does it look like, and going back to the affirmative action question that you actually asked me, would be around, this idea that this repair that we're talking about, this reconciliation, right? It requires us to take accountability for more than just good intentions. So many institutions and we only want to take accountability when our impact can still mean harm, even with good intentions. And so I think, when we think about affirmative action, we're talking about it through this prism of, well, it's done what it's supposed to do, right? It's time to move on, right? Don't we have an equitable access? And we're if we're still talking about the ramifications of a city plan from 1928, how can we think that we've done the undoing of generations of harm? Someone mentioned the boots, lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. And I think about all the time that, I have colleagues or peers, and I say, your grandfather fought in World War II, and he came back and he got a free house, free education, right, and access to all these resources. Our grandfathers came back from World War II, and that was it. They came back, right? So we're talking about 3 generations of wealth and access. And so it's going to take more than just one policy to shift that. This has to be a cultural shift. And so I think my thought around specifically affirmative action, but I think we could, take that on a macro level, talking about housing, talking about education, talking about healthcare equity, is that there has to be a sustained presence around this. And it will require many of us, I think, to move out of our space of convenience and comfort to actually shift the way in which we build I don't even like to say democracy, to build a liberated future.
Some prophetic fire there from Virginia. So, Peniel, you use the word morality, and I want to trouble that because we have a selective morality, right? We have institutions, and we have shibboleths, and we have utterances, we have faith systems that proclaim morality, but it's selective, right? Something like the right to bear arms is sacrosanct, that can't be touched. But something like the humanity of Black and Native American people, that's past tense. We don't worry about that. And one thing I really sort of think about, again, I just came from the UK, and there's an interesting conversation. I can't proclaim that it's a nationwide conversation, but the role that Britain has played in colonialism is really coming to the forefront. You go into the museums, there are displays, there's discussions about why do we have things we have, what's happening going forward. And, I think Virginia really nailed it. This issue of intergenerational transfer of wealth, and that's a concept I didn't understand until I was in graduate school. But it is as simple as explaining to people and I actually recommend another book to people, which is The Dream Hoarders by Richard Reeves. And in that book, Reeves describes class progression in this country, socioeconomic movement is quite difficult. And it's because of these things that are invisible or normalized. And we've essentialized these systemic failures by making them individual things. So that person is a bad person or a lazy person or a not hardworking person versus there's actually systems in place that makes it impossible or very difficult for those people to succeed. And I think that's one of the profound pieces of misinformation in American history. And in fact, every year, at the beginning of the year, we have something called the Reading Roundup, which is conducted by my team in the undergraduate college. And we ask our faculty to read a book with incoming students. And I read the book on Juneteenth with students. It's a short book, first of all, so they'll read it. And it's a book by a Texan, Annette Gordon Reed, right? And it talks about Juneteenth, but it talks about so much more. And she has a quote that I always share with the students, which makes it very much about what we do here and what we do in this particular place. And it says, Texas is where I learned to think that people could and should try in whatever way they can to make life better for others alive today and for those to come. About the difficulties of Texas, love does not require taking an uncritical stance toward the object of one's affections. In truth, it often requires the opposite. We can't be of real service to the hopes that we have for places and people, ourselves included, without a clear-eyed assessment of their and our strengths and weaknesses. That often demands a willingness to be critical, sometimes deeply so. And back to the quote that Yaki had mentioned earlier from James Baldwin, it is because of the profound love that people of color, and particularly black people, have had in this country, is that we keep on saying, wait, this is the idea. This was the concept, right? This is the moral underpinnings of this country. Do better, right? If you hadn't said this, we wouldn't be asking for it, right? And I think that's something that we have a real hard time grappling with. And that's part of the, that's the delay, really. When we start having that clear-eyed realization that there is a moral deficiency, there's a moral, Dr. King called it a check for insufficient funds. When we start really talking about that, and I also give credit to Craig Stephen Wilder for his book, Ebony and Ivory, who really exposed that the institutions that are so, I always tell people my favorite trivia question is the oldest corporation in the United States, the Harvard Corporation, 1636, right? So the oldest institutions in this country actively were built on slave labor or the profits from slave labor. And the removal and outright theft of land and property for Native Americans. That is a reality we have to come to deal with. And I think we should have robust discussions about how we reckon with that. But we can't stop not talking about it. That was a really convoluted way to say what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm trying to say? We have to start, engaging that conversation. Here's the thing. Many of us have been talking about this for quite some time. It's time to listen, and it's time to hold people accountable. In that sense, I think it's possible to have a conservative mindset and actually have this conversation at the same time. They're not exclusive things, but again, selective morality is a problem here. If we're gonna be truly moral, if we're gonna follow these faith systems and these systems of government that claim to have moral grounding, it needs to be consistent, and we need to call people out when they're not being consistent.
No, I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think what I'd add is that this idea of freedom and liberation, we all have different definitions of that. And I think that, unfortunately, some folks have confused Black people's access to capitalism as meaning that we're free, meaning that we're liberated. And that's not the same, right? Yes, I have access to, things that my ancestors didn't. I can purchase certain things and I can do all this stuff, which, that's a whole nother conversation around how that can kind of take you off track. So that's the first thing I would say. And just thinking about, I think I have more questions than answers to this, right? Thinking about, for me, this frustration around how do we have these conversations when my lived experiences and those of people who are part of my community for generations have not been believed. How do we have these conversations of why even affirmative actions was necessary in the first place? Why when I want to get my house, assessment, appraisal on my house, I'm worried that I may need to take down all the pictures to show them that I'm Black because I'll have a different outcome than somebody else, or worrying about when getting a house loan, and these are things that have come up, worrying about when I go to the doctor, especially as a Black woman, my pain not being believed, right? So all those kind of things that we navigate, not to mention, obviously, things around policing and so many things, right? That is a part of my everyday existence, and just as I was coming here, I was thinking about, my great-grandparents were enslaved, right? And on my mother's side, were enslaved in this city and surrounding areas. And that was not that long ago. My grandparents' grandparents, and thinking about that. And then my grandparents rearing my mother who reared me and all that trauma, right? And then you can go, we talk about enslavement, but then thinking about the period from Reconstruction on, right? That people are calling, the nadir, right? The second slavery, all these things that happened then when all of the land that was taken and all the horrible things that happened, continuing on to Jim Crow and into where we are today. All of those things, live in us. That trauma, that violence, and then feeling like you have to continue to try to convince people of your everyday reality. It makes me, I'm woeful around how do I do that? How do I do that without recreating this violence for myself? So.
It's really good. It's really good. I want to, with the time we have left, do we have any questions? I want to get some audience. Any questions? Jacob, can we,
what happened to the microphones?
There's one over there.
Take it off.
Do you want to swap here?
Or just take, we can share.
We can swap.
This one?
He's giving it to Jacob.
Let's keep the podium ones.
Okay.
I'll take these.
Okay, you got a mic. Right now.
This one?
It's muted too. Oh.
Okay, you're good.
Check, mic check, here we go. So, my question is, I know we're celebrating Juneteenth, and I'd like to hear, quickly how we reconcile and deal with the fact that slavery is not abolished, right? It's not abolished. And how are we living with that on a day-to-day basis? And the fact that there's a wonderful genealogist by the name of Antoinette Harrell, who actually is called the Slavery Detective, and she has done work where she goes into rural parts of Mississippi, Alabama, et cetera, and uncover the fact that there are African-descended people who were enslaved until the 60s, 1960s. And actually, if you go on Vice, there's an expose on her, and she's speaking to one of the men who is alive right now, who was enslaved on a plantation in the 1960s in Mississippi. Black person, okay? So that's always the question for me, is like we can talk about these things in the past, but I'd love to know, how that viscerally exists in you, knowing that slavery still exists.
Well, very quickly, I think that this is where the work of Mariame Kaba and people who define themselves as abolitionists come in, and some people will argue that those folks who are living and working in prisons are also being enslaved, and they should have voting rights, and they should have dignity and humanity, and they died disproportionately during COVID, and Black people are 12% of the population, 38%, 36% of those who are incarcerated. I think the biggest thing is what we're talking about here in this panel. I think this idea of imagining and how do we define abolition, right? And Du Bois called it abolition democracy. I think Angela Davis has defined it really in the way that I started this we started tonight or this afternoon, freedom beyond emancipation. You know, Toni Morrison defines it in very specific ways, not just in Beloved, but in Sula and Song of Solomon. It's an abolition of both systems of punishment that we've gotten used to, like Virginia was saying, but it's also an imagining of what comes after. And that's where Toni Morrison is so great, because she gives you the what comes after. And the what comes after, sometimes people don't know what to do with it, because a lot of times Toni Morrison finds the sublime in the quotidian, the everyday, right? And by the time she won the Pulitzer, there's a great interview online with Toni Morrison, and the 60 Minutes, it could be Ed Bradley, it could be somebody else, especially as a Gen Xer. Remember Ed Bradley? He was the only black man on television growing up, you know? Ed Bradley, he was the only one you could find, right? You're like, we exist, Ed Bradley is on Sunday night. We were very excited, Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. That's my childhood. But he you know, there's one time, there's another, it's Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose is asking Toni Morrison, why aren't there any white people in your books? And she's saying, that, look, that doesn't define me and our experience. We know that all that happened, but I'm interested in what do black people do in the aftermath and right? And so that's one viewpoint of abolition. So I think what you're talking about really profound, but it's how do we think about, you know, abolition, you know, this idea of abolition in a way that doesn't frighten people. Because when you say abolish anything, whether people are saying police or punishment or prisons, it frightens Americans because so many people, we've defined those things as instruments that protect us against black people, that protect us against queer people, that indigenous, Hispanic, so many different people, at times Jewish, you know, Muslims. We define it as that. We have to, and I agree with Virginia in terms of a new cultural framework would allow us to not define it as so. And it also, a new cultural framework would allow us to not think of your success as diminishing me. You know, I live in Hyde Park. If 50 black people moved into Hyde Park, I think it would cause a revolution. Just 50 black neighbors, 50. Sure would. Hyde Park has thousands of people in it. But it's the racial segregation, because there used to be, in the same neighborhood I live in, there were, when Hyde Park was advertised, they advertised it as an all-white neighborhood. And when you see the advertisements, they're psyched about that. They're just like, there's no black people gonna be here. And it's almost like we're supposed to be jumping for joy. And I'm like, I'm gonna grab it and say, yeah, you know, let's go to this neighborhood. And that's like our history, right? So I think abolition is the key there.
You know what's interesting about that, Peniel, is that the document that's the framework for all of the anti-DEI legislation from the Manhattan Institute is titled Abolish DEI. Wow. Abolition can happen when you're interested in it. Just saying.
Wow. I did not know that. Wow is what my reply is. We had a question right here.
Yes.
No, we have a question right here.
Okay, that's fine. But you know, this black person was waiting here much longer than her.
I think she was the first person to raise her hand. But who's that? I think she did. She did? Okay. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
When we talk about abolishing, or not even using that word, abolishing, when we talk about Juneteenth, when we talk about freedom, justice, and so forth, it's so important that you have black people who are formerly incarcerated on that panel. And it's particularly going to say it's none of us. Particularly going to say it's either all of us or none of us. Include black people who are formerly incarcerated in that narrative. Quite often when we have these panels involving UT and you're talking about dismantling systems, quite often you don't have black people from the community who are rooted and grounded, boots on the ground, boots on the ground, sitting on these panels. I mean, quite often you have like academics, people with degrees, and that's wonderful and everything, but don't forget there's street people who also, people from the streets, people from the community who help push this conversation further. Okay, I'm not through because, I mean, we can go into like dismantling colorism, interracism, and thinking white is right and Eurocentric standards of beauty. And I think some of y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about who's dating who's marrying who has children with who, but we could talk about those uncomfortable conversations about talking black and sleeping. We can have that conversation too. But let's bring it back to the formerly incarcerated. You cannot tell me about justice and fail to include them. Fail to include someone who's formerly incarcerated at the table, having a conversation about dismantling systems. Also, if you're gonna tell me about outreach, go to communities. Go into those communities, reach those black people out there. The challenge that I have for you is I want you to sponsor a black person's bail, sponsor a black person's trial, get them an attorney. We have a criminal and civil rights attorney right here, Malcolm Greenstein, but also there's black attorneys out there that you can also reach out to. Bobby Taylor, a bunch of black attorneys. And
Okay,
also include
well, I'm going to stop right
post-conviction
there
writ
because
and
we're
so
at
forth.
time, but thank you for your comments, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Well, address it. I also wanted to address too. I want to hear some input from the panel. You want to be uncomfortable, so we're asking you to dismantle and be uncomfortable.
Do you want to?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think part of what Stephanie and I were talking about earlier, that is, we're gathered here at UT, right? We're at the LBJ school that's somewhat in proximity to I-35, but oftentimes it is this, the dynamic we've created is the community can come to us and the community, well, not us, I don't work here, but the community can come to UT, right, and be taught, right, be encouraged. But instead, what is the reallocation of resources to invest in the work of people who've already been doing the labor? And unapologetically, we just launched a fund where we literally just want to write checks to women of color who are doing abolitionist work in criminal justice, who are doing abolitionist work around health inequities, because we create these dynamics, as you were saying, where those voices aren't even in the room, right? We're talking about them without input, without understanding. But instead of having to have our logo on doors, having our logo on the event, what does it look like to, as you said, sponsor a bail, or to really just trust the community to do the work? We're often asking, jump through 12 hoops to apply for this grant, which is a full-time job, right? And it has to be done in the language that we have deemed fit for these funds. Oh, and then by the way, when you get the funds, you have to do all these metrics so that it fits really beautifully in our annual report. That's not the work of abolition. That's not the work of repair. That's control. It's controlling how you get to be about your own freedom. And so completely, I've seen your work up close and from afar, and I think that is truth that needs to be made, even those of us who sit in positions on these panels, uncomfortable about even the way we're doing the work of repair. So thank you.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I guess I'll just also echo, I agree with what you're saying. I will say, well, that may not be helpful. I was going to say maybe get to know some of us, because I hear you, but yeah, and what was said earlier was about, I'm led by what the community has done. I'm trying to amplify the work that's been done for a really long time. And we do all need to be checked on that. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and your point about, folks who have been, in the criminal justice system, they do need to come to the table more, and they need to be present, and their stories need to be told, and they need to speak. So I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'll conclude by saying certainly the center, we've had folks who are formerly incarcerated on panels. We've done so much to leverage and amplify. And even though those of us here might be activists and scholars, we're also in the community. I know I'm in the community, but at the same time, I'm not trying to get into a debate over authenticity and what we all do. But I appreciate the comments, absolutely. This is a great way to end our panel. Thank you so much to all of you. I think this has been an extraordinary Freedom Summit in terms of Juneteenth. We're going to have a reception outside in Bass, so I hope everybody, not outside literally, it's going to be outside. I hope people stay so you can congregate, you can network. The one thing I'd like to leave us all with in terms of a call, and a lot of times people say, what is our charge and what should we leave this gathering with, is really a call for all of us to be more engaged in the work, because we are at a very, very precipitous time in our history. When I say post-consensus, I don't mean that in a way to be politically correct. I'm saying we have lost the racial justice consensus that argued that black dignity and citizenship should be the beating heart of American democracy, and we've lost that to all of our detriment, including, and in certain ways, especially the University of Texas at Austin right now, and the city of Austin, the state of Texas. So when I say that post-consensus, I think that we have the opportunity to build a new consensus together, and that consensus should be both a moral and political consensus, but not a cheap morality of people not walking the talk, but a real, when we think about morality, of thinking about our children, thinking about justice, thinking about equality and equity for all. And again, even when we disagree with each other, refusing to scapegoat each other just because we disagree. Refusing to scapegoat anyone who's part of any political organization, as long as I think they have respect for humanity and human lives and believe in this idea of multiracial democracy. I'm with anybody who's interested in small d democracy for everybody. Right? And I think that when we think about Juneteenth, this idea of freedom beyond emancipation, I hope we leave this summit energized and really prepared to be inspired and to continue to do the work. And the work of Juneteenth is really the work of citizenship, dignity, democracy for all people. Thank you.